The businessman's racism underestimated her, but she surprised everyone, not knowing that their encounter would shape the future of both and an entire city. The city of Velmor rises under the golden glow of sunset, a complex blend of traditions and modernity, where the past and the future intertwine on every winding street and bustling avenue. Founded centuries ago, the city preserves in its red brick buildings and clay-tiled roofs the stories of generations who built their lives between the hills and the river that flows through the region. In contrast, glass and steel skyscrapers punctuate the skyline, symbolizing the rapid modernization Velmor has experienced in recent years, a transition often made at the expense of those living in its more humble neighborhoods. In the heart of this city, where tradition and modernity almost clash, lives Ivanna. The 28-year-old architect grew up in the alleys of one of Velmor's oldest neighborhoods, known as Baixa Aldora, an area characterized by narrow streets, old houses, and a lingering sense of neglect by the authorities. But for Ivanna, Baixa Aldora has always been a place of resilience, where the community came together to face hardships and where she learned early on to appreciate every bit of history embedded in the weathered walls of the houses and forgotten squares. Every day, Ivanna walks through the streets of Baixa Aldora to the office where she works, Heritage & Company, a renowned architecture firm that occupies a restored old building in the city's most upscale area. The office is located in Lira Alta, a central neighborhood surrounded by luxurious cafes, designer shops, and headquarters of major companies. The transition between the humble neighborhood and the central area feels like crossing a portal. From the sound of children playing in the narrow streets of Baixa Aldora, she moves to the marble sidewalks and shiny storefronts of Lira Alta, where people walk hurriedly, focused on their own worlds. Ivanna's routine is marked by this contrast, a constant reminder of how the city she lives in is divided not just by neighborhoods, but by completely different worlds. As she walks, she observes the cafe windows where businesspeople discuss the next big real estate developments, ignoring that just a few blocks away, families struggle to pay rent for their dilapidated homes. Ivanna knows her dream of transforming Velmor is seen as a utopia by many of her colleagues, but she refuses to give up. Ivanna holds onto the memory of her grandfather, a bricklayer who helped build many of Baixa Aldora's old buildings. He used to take her through the neighborhood streets and point out every detail of a building, explaining the story behind each arch and column. "The walls tell stories, Ivanna," he would say, with a look that mixed pride and sadness. These stories not only fueled her love for architecture but also sparked in Ivanna a desire to preserve and revitalize what many considered irrelevant. However, within the doors of Heritage & Company, Ivanna feels the weight of prejudice in every meeting. She is the office's young promise, a woman with brown skin and curly hair who stands out from the standard among other architects, most of whom come from traditional families and graduated from the country's top universities. Her talent is recognized but rarely taken seriously. Her detailed and passionate sketches are often filed away, while more commercial projects take priority. Even so, Ivanna persists. Her ideas are deeply informed by the needs of the city, especially areas like Baixa Aldora, which have been neglected amid Velmor's rapid growth. She dreams of creating spaces where children can play safely, where the elderly can sit in squares without fear, where homes are restored rather than demolished to make way for new developments. Her latest project is a revitalization plan for the neighborhood where she grew up, combining innovative architectural solutions with respect for the collective memory of the residents. But every attempt to present this idea to the firm's investors is met with cynical comments and disdainful glances. In this context, Hector emerges, a businessman whose influence in Velmor is nearly unquestionable. Owner of Barrow and ACO Construction, Hector is known for being one of the main drivers behind the city's new look. His luxury projects stand out in the most affluent areas, and his presence is a status symbol in Velmor's business circles. With his tailored suit and a watch that costs more than many of the houses Ivanna hopes to restore, he is a man of strong opinions who values progress above all else, even if it means erasing the city's traces of history. Hector and Ivanna meet for the first time in a meeting at the architecture firm. It is a crucial day for Ivanna, as she has been invited to present her revitalization project for Baixa Aldora to a group of investors that includes Hector. She arrives early, reviewing every detail of her presentation, arranging the sketchboards with trembling hands but a determined gaze. Across the meeting room table, Hector idly flips through some proposals, glancing impatiently at his watch, paying little attention to the young architect. When it's Ivanna's turn, she stands up and begins to speak passionately about the neighborhood's potential, highlighting how each architectural intervention can transform the residents' lives. The sketches show tree-lined streets, restored squares, and community centers she plans to create in partnership with local artists and residents. With each slide, Ivanna tries to bring out the essence of Baixa Aldora, a place that, to her, is a living museum of Velmor's history. But Hector interrupts her presentation with a cynical smile. "It's an interesting proposal, but don't you think it's a bit too idealistic?" he says, with a tone that makes his disdain clear. "These old areas are difficult to revitalize. I believe the best option would be to tear everything down and start over, don't you think? After all, what Velmor needs is progress, not nostalgia." Hector's words feel like a stab to Ivanna. She tries to argue, explaining that tearing down these buildings would mean erasing the history and identity of hundreds of families, but she realizes that to Hector, her words sound like an emotional plea, not a viable proposal. He looks at her with the coldness of someone who has made up his mind before even listening. The tension in the room is palpable, and Ivanna senses the gazes of other architects who, as usual, prefer not to oppose the businessman. After the meeting, Ivanna stays at the office, looking at the sketches now tucked away in her folder, feeling the weight of rejection. But there's something she cannot ignore. A new opportunity is on the horizon. ArcVision, an international firm looking to invest in innovative urban revitalization projects, has announced that it will be in Velmor to evaluate proposals. For Ivanna, this is her chance to try again, to push her vision forward. However, there is an unexpected condition. ArcVision requires Ivanna to be the lead architect and to collaborate with Barrow and ACO Construction. Hector is the only one who can make the large-scale execution of the project possible. The news reaches Hector as an unwelcome surprise. He sees it as a challenge to his authority but also recognizes that without ArcVision, he would miss out on a lucrative expansion opportunity. Reluctantly, he agrees to the condition but makes it clear from the start that he does not believe in Ivanna's ideas and that he will do everything possible to keep the project under his control. Ivanna, on the other hand, sees the new partnership as a last chance. She knows it will be a challenge to work alongside Hector, a man whose vision is entirely opposite to hers, but she also understands that this might be her only opportunity to transform Velmor from the inside out. As she leaves the office that evening, Ivanna walks back to Baixa Aldora, feeling the cold wind blowing through the empty streets. She looks at the worn facades, the old lampposts that timidly light the cracked sidewalks, and makes a silent promise. No matter what happens, she will fight to ensure that the stories her grandfather told her and the memories of the residents are not erased. Little does she know that this decision will mark the beginning of a journey filled with challenges and twists, where her own worth will be tested, and where Hector will discover that Velmor holds far more secrets than he ever imagined. The sky over Velmor remained gray, thick with clouds threatening another storm. Outside the architecture firm, Ivanna waited anxiously, watching the raindrops start to drum against the window. Her thoughts were restless, like the wind blowing through the narrow streets. She had spent the last few nights refining her presentation, knowing that the fate of her revitalization project and perhaps her entire career hinged on that day. Inside the Heritage and Company meeting room, the atmosphere was cold and austere, with bare concrete walls and minimalist furniture. Hector was already there, seated at the head of the long oak table, adjusting the cuffs of his suit while glancing impatiently at his watch. He always made a point to arrive before any meeting. It was his way of asserting his position of power, ensuring that everyone knew he was the one setting the pace of the negotiations. Ivanna entered the room with hesitant steps, but quickly straightened her posture. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she wouldn't let Hector see her insecurity. With a polite smile, she laid her boards on the table and began organizing the documents, trying to ignore the cold look he directed at her. The silence in the room was uncomfortable, laden with a tension that hung in the air. Hector analyzed Ivanna from head to toe, as if trying to see beyond her simple clothes and determined gaze. To him, she was just another young architect, idealistic and unaware of the real difficulties of the market. But there was something about the firmness with which she held her boards that intrigued him, though he would never admit it. "Let's get straight to the point," Hector said, in a tone that left no room for small talk. "I'm not a fan of wasting time with fanciful ideas, so I hope your proposal is practical." Ivanna took a deep breath, ignoring the remark and adjusting the projector. The images of her boards appeared on the white wall, showing the worn-out streets of Baixa Aldora, the old houses with their decrepit facades, and the cracked sidewalks that Ivanna knew so well. But alongside these images, she projected her designs: tree-lined streets, revitalized squares, vibrant community centers. "Baixa Aldora is a treasure of history and culture," Ivanna began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I grew up there. I know the potential that exists in those narrow streets, those forgotten facades. My plan isn't just to restore old buildings, but to give the community back their pride in their roots, creating spaces where history and modernity can coexist." Hector crossed his arms, impassive, as he listened to Ivanna. His eyes scanned the projected images with skepticism, but he maintained a calculated silence. Internally, he had already decided that Ivanna's proposal was naive and impractical. In his view, what Velmor needed were robust projects, developments that would attract high-level investors, not a sentimental restoration of old buildings. But before he could voice his disdain, the meeting room door opened, and 3 foreign executives entered, wearing well-tailored suits and exuding an air of authority. They were representatives from ArcVision, the international firm interested in urban revitalization projects. Hector quickly adjusted his demeanor, putting on a professional smile and standing to greet them, though he was still unconvinced that Ivanna was the right person for the job. The ArcVision representatives listened attentively to Ivanna's presentation, asking detailed questions about the technical feasibility and costs of the project. Ivanna, confident in her responses, argued that the revitalization of Baixa Aldora would not only be a social investment but also a way to enhance Velmor's historical heritage, attracting tourists and new businesses. Hector, however, took every opportunity to suggest alternative approaches, implying that a total rebuild would be more profitable. "The truth is, to fully revitalize a neighborhood like this, you need a more pragmatic approach," Hector said, casting a condescending glance in Ivanna's direction. "Replacing some of these old buildings with more modern structures would guarantee a return. After all, nostalgia doesn't pay the bills, does it?" Ivanna pressed her lips together, tasting the bitterness of his words. But before she could respond, one of the ArcVision executives intervened. "Actually, Mr. Hector, it's precisely that approach we're trying to avoid," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're looking for projects that respect the identity of local communities. And for that, we believe Ivanna is the best person to lead this project." Hector's expression hardened, as if he had just taken an unexpected blow. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear he felt uncomfortable having his authority questioned by international investors right in Velmor's own territory. However, he knew that ArcVision's presence was crucial to his expansion plans, and losing that contract would be a disaster for his business. After a brief moment of silence, Hector forced a smile. "Very well then," he replied, looking directly at Ivanna. "If that's how you prefer it, we'll work together. But let me make it clear from the start, Ivanna. I hope you're ready to deal with the real challenges of a project of this scale. This isn't a fairy tale." Ivanna kept her posture steady, but a mix of relief and apprehension swirled inside her chest. The partnership was sealed, but the battle was far from over. The feeling of victory was tempered by the certainty that Hector wouldn't make the path easy. In that room, amid glances of distrust and veiled promises of challenges, the most unlikely partnership in Velmor began. As the meeting came to a close and the Archvision executives left the room, Ivanna gathered her things with trembling hands, trying to hide the overflow of emotions within her. She knew she would have to face Hector's disdain and criticisms at every step of the project, but there was a glimmer of hope in her heart. This might be her chance to finally give voice to the dreams of revitalization she had carried since childhood. As Hector watched Ivanna leave the room with her sketches under her arm, he could hardly believe he had been forced to agree to work with someone like her. To him, it was an insult to his experience and his vision for Velmor. Yet, something inside him, a feeling he didn't want to acknowledge, began to take root, a curiosity about what this determined young woman might bring to a project that, until then, he considered destined for failure. Little did they know that this partnership, forced and fraught with tension, would transform their lives and the city of Velmor in ways neither could have anticipated. The sun rose behind Velmor's hills, casting a soft light over the awakening streets of Baixa Aldora. The neighborhood, still marked by worn facades and clay rooftops, seemed to take a brief breath under the golden rays that touched the old buildings. Ivanna walked along the uneven sidewalks, attentively observing every detail of the houses, shops, and alleys where she used to play as a child. Every corner of this place carried a memory, a story she wanted to protect. With her sketchbook under her arm and a clipboard filled with maps and notes, she headed to the project's meeting point, where Hector waited beside an imposing black truck. His presence there felt strange and out of place in Baixa Aldora, a stark contrast to the simple streets and the modest community that lived there. As Ivanna approached, she noticed Hector's expression, once again filled with impatience. "You're late, Ivanna," he said, his voice laced with displeasure. "We can't afford to waste time here. We have a lot to do." Ivanna quickly glanced at her watch. She wasn't late. He had arrived early as usual to maintain control of the situation. But she chose not to argue, knowing that such discussions wouldn't help. She took a deep breath and began organizing the project's documents and plans, while Hector watched her with his arms crossed. The first visit to the neighborhood was crucial for defining the revitalization details, and Ivanna was eager to show Hector what she had in mind. However, the tension between them was evident in every word exchanged, every gesture, and every prolonged silence. Hector questioned every decision Ivanna made, from the choice of materials to the placement of benches in the future plazas. "Is this really necessary?" he asked with a disdainful tone as he looked at the sketches of a small community park Ivanna planned to create in the neighborhood center. It would be much easier and quicker to pave this area and turn it into a parking lot. It would add a lot more value. "Value for whom, Hector?" Ivanna replied, unable to contain her irritation. "The neighborhood needs spaces where people can gather, not more concrete. The kids here have nowhere to play, and the elderly have no safe place to sit and chat. This park could be a space for the community to reconnect." Hector let out a restrained laugh, as if finding Ivanna's words absurdly naive. "You're confusing your personal feelings with the real needs of the project, Ivanna. It might be a nice idea on paper, but what matters here is profitability. This neighborhood will only thrive if we attract investors and new high-income residents. A park isn't going to bring that." Ivanna felt her blood boil but took a deep breath to keep calm. She knew that clashing with Hector wouldn't get her anywhere at that moment. Instead, she tried a different approach. "What if we did both?" she suggested, attempting a conciliatory tone. "We can create the recreational area that enhances the surroundings, while also working on improvements that make Baixa Aldora more appealing to investments. If we give the community something they can use, they'll be more willing to support the changes that come afterward." Hector looked at Ivanna for a long moment, as if considering her words. But deep down, he still saw that enthusiasm as a weakness, a flaw in judgment. To him, Ivanna was still just an idealistic young woman who didn't understand the harsh realities of the real estate market. Even so, with a sigh, he agreed to move on to the next stage of the visit, but not without making it clear that every choice would need to be thoroughly justified to him. Meanwhile, Ivanna's presence was beginning to be noticed by the community. During the visit, she made a point of stopping to talk to the residents she met on the streets. It was a simple gesture, but it made all the difference. Donna Lourdes, an elderly woman with white hair who had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years, was one of the first to approach. "Ivanna, dear, I heard you're involved in some projects around here. Is that true?" Donna Lourdes asked with a kind smile. "You know, I think it's good to have someone who knows us, who remembers how it used to be, taking care of these things." Ivanna smiled, feeling a warm sense of familiarity in her chest. "Yes, it's true, Donna Lourdes. We're working on some ideas to improve the neighborhood, but I don't want anyone here to feel left out of the process. I'll do my best to make sure everyone is heard." Hector, watching the interaction from a distance, felt a growing discomfort. He couldn't understand why Ivanna wasted time talking to people who, in his view, would have no influence on the project's success. To him, what mattered were the numbers, the investors, the profit projections. The smiles of Baixa Aldora's residents weren't part of the equation. Later, while they analyzed the neighborhood's old buildings, Hector continued to pressure Ivanna, trying to find some flaw in her proposals. "Do you really think this old architecture has anything to offer?" he provoked as he looked at a house with a worn facade. "This is just a pile of rubble waiting to be demolished. I don't see how preserving this could be a good business decision." Ivanna paused for a moment and looked at the house, her eyes capturing the details of the wooden windows and the remaining tiles at the entrance. It was a house that, like so many others in Baixa Aldora, bore the marks of time, but also the history of several generations. "This is Velmor's history, Hector," she said with a firmness that surprised even herself. "Each of these houses is a testament to the people who lived here, who built this city. If we tear everything down, we erase the memories of people like my grandmother, who spent her entire life in this neighborhood. I'm not asking you to understand, but to trust what I can do for this place." Hector raised an eyebrow but did not respond immediately. There was something in Ivanna's determination that he wasn't used to facing, and it made him uneasy. He wouldn't admit it, but he was beginning to realize that, despite his disagreements with her ideas, she spoke with a passion he didn't see in any of his own projects. Something beyond profit, something he had long since lost when his life had become a series of numbers and reports. As the day dragged on, the tension between them seemed to grow, like a storm approaching on the horizon. Each time Hector challenged Ivanna's ideas, she responded with arguments and a determined look, refusing to back down. And as he observed the way Ivanna interacted with the residents, an unsettling thought began to take root in his mind, a thought he refused to accept. What if, somehow, she was right? Thus ended the first day of their joint work in Baixa Aldora, with both returning to their respective routines, Hector to his luxury penthouse and Ivanna to the small apartment she shared with a friend. But something had already changed, even if subtly. Each carried a new restlessness within them, something that would make them reconsider their next decisions. The partnership had begun turbulently, and both knew that the days ahead would be even more challenging. But like two opposite pieces of a puzzle, perhaps they were destined to complete each other in a way neither of them could yet see. The first weeks of working together were a constant battle of wills. Ivanna and Hector met daily to discuss every detail of the project, from the choice of materials to the layout of the revitalized spaces in Baixa Aldora. Each decision brought friction, Hector's sharp comments, and Ivanna's quiet resistance. She knew the best way to confront him was through results, not words. So, she threw herself into every detail with a meticulousness bordering on obsession. Hector watched Ivanna's dedication with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. As much as he tried to keep control over the project, Ivanna found ways to surprise him, to counter his suggestions with creative, well-grounded ideas. In one of these meetings, Hector proposed the removal of a group of old trees that occupied a small square in the center of the neighborhood. To him, The trees were merely obstacles to constructing a new commercial area. "We can cut down these trees and turn this space into an outdoor food court," Hector said, pointing to the maps with a self-assured smile. "It will increase foot traffic and attract new businesses to the neighborhood. This kind of attraction is what ArcVision and the investors want to see." Ivanna frowned, as if Hector's words were a personal affront. She moved closer to the sketches and touched the drawing of the trees, her hands tracing the outline of each trunk she had drawn so carefully. "These trees are part of Baixa Aldora's history, Hector," she replied, keeping her voice steady but with a determined look. "People here have gathered under them for decades. Cutting them down would mean erasing a piece of this place's collective memory. We can find a way to integrate the food court without destroying everything that already exists here." Hector rolled his eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh, but before he could argue, the meeting room door opened, and a group of residents entered, led by Dona Lourdes. Ivanna had invited the community to a presentation on the revitalization plans, an attempt to include their voices in the project and, at the same time, show Hector that the residents played an important role in the transformation of Baixa Aldora. Dona Lourdes walked up to Ivanna with a warm smile, completely ignoring Hector's expression of displeasure. Beside her, children, young people, and the elderly took their seats, all curious to understand what the young architect had planned for the place where they had lived their lives. "You did well to invite us, Ivanna," said Dona Lourdes, squeezing Ivanna's hands with gratitude. "It's good to know that someone cares about listening to us." Ivanna felt the warmth of the woman's hands and returned the smile. She turned to Hector, who watched the scene with a serious, almost challenging expression, and began the presentation, showing sketches, ideas for restoring facades, creating gathering spaces, and plans to preserve the central square's trees. The residents reacted to each slide with exclamations of approval and hopeful smiles. Ivanna explained how each change would benefit the community, how the new spaces would respect the stories told by the old walls. And as he heard the applause from the residents, Hector began to realize that Ivanna had something he had underestimated, a genuine connection with those people, something he could never buy or force. Yet, Hector remained skeptical, convinced that the community's desires wouldn't be enough to make the project a financial success. He approached Ivanna at the end of the presentation, as the residents dispersed, still chatting excitedly about the changes to come. "That was a nice presentation for the masses, Ivanna," he said, a mix of irony and frustration in his tone. "But it's not the community that's going to fund this. It's the investors, and they want to see a return, not a square full of sentimental stories." Ivanna didn't respond immediately. She looked at Hector, trying to decipher what lay behind that mask of coldness and sarcasm. She knew that, behind all that cynicism, Hector also had a story, a reason for being the way he was. But he would never let her see any weakness. To Hector, opening up was a sign of losing control, and he couldn't afford to lose anything. "You're right, Hector," Ivanna finally said, her tone calm but firm. "But I'm going to show you that we can do both. And I'll prove that Baixa Aldora deserves more than just being erased to make way for new buildings." The challenge was set. Hector narrowed his eyes, feeling a mix of anger and admiration for Ivanna's confidence. Deep down, there was a part of him that started to wonder, what if she succeeded? What if, somehow, this bold young woman he had so underestimated was right about how to transform Velmor? But he pushed these thoughts aside with a sigh, determined to stay focused on the numbers, deadlines, and targets. In the days that followed, Ivanna began spending more time in Baixa Aldora, talking to residents and adjusting project details according to their suggestions. She met with local carpenters, shop owners, and even street artists, incorporating their ideas into the plans. With each visit, more people joined the meetings, beginning to see Ivanna as a representative of their voices, an ally in a process that had always seemed distant and unattainable. For Hector, however, each adjustment suggested by Ivanna felt like a step closer to what he considered impractical. He watched from a distance as Ivanna interacted with the residents, feeling increasingly out of place in that setting. The community that Ivanna sought to integrate into the project was, to him, an extra burden, an unnecessary complication that would only delay the schedule. But there was something in the way the residents' eyes lit up when they spoke with Ivanna, a light he hadn't seen in his own projects for a long time. A light that, despite himself, reminded him of his youth, when he believed he could change the world with every building he constructed. During a particularly tense meeting at the office, Hector finally lost his patience. They were arguing about the project's budget, and Ivanna insisted on preserving an old mansion that had once served as a cultural center for the neighborhood. "This is going to cost us double, Ivanna," he exclaimed, slamming the spreadsheets onto the table. "And for what? To preserve a pile of rubble that no one cares about? The reality is that this place has no commercial value." Ivanna stepped closer, her eyes burning with indignation. Hector had never seen her so determined. "It might not have value to you, Hector," she replied, her voice low but filled with emotion. "But it has value to the people who live here. And I'm going to fight for this place, even if you don't understand. You might see this as a financial risk, but for me, it's a promise. And I don't break my promises." Hector was silent for a moment, surprised by the intensity in Ivanna's voice. He wanted to argue back, to remind her that the real world didn't care about promises, but something in her expression made him hesitate. She truly believed in what she was saying, in a way that he had long forgotten how to believe in anything. In that moment, Hector felt, for the first time, a small sliver of doubt creeping into his certainties. And though he wouldn't admit it, it disturbed him deeply. Ivanna left the room feeling a mix of frustration and relief. She knew Hector's resistance wouldn't be easy to overcome, but she also sensed that, in some way, he was beginning to hear her words, even if reluctantly. As she walked back through the streets of Baixa Aldora, the cold wind brushing her face, she felt that each step brought her closer to her dream, and to something deeper that was yet to come. The days in Velmor were marked by a fast pace, with construction trucks crossing the downtown streets and cranes rising like steel giants among the old buildings. Baixa Aldora, in turn, found itself caught up in a new movement, one that brought hope to some, but for others, represented the uncertainty of a transformation that few fully understood. Ivanna divided her time between the offices of Heritage and Company and the streets of Baixa Aldora, reviewing blueprints and adjusting schedules, always in close contact with the community that trusted her so much. But with each meeting with Hector, she felt the pressure mounting. Deadlines were tightening, costs were rising, and the investors wanted results. Hector grew increasingly impatient, his critiques becoming harsher with every delay or obstacle. "We need to cut costs, Ivanna," he said during yet another tense meeting, his voice full of frustration. "This mansion you insist on restoring has already exceeded the initial budget. If we don't adjust this, ArcVision might start reconsidering their investment." Ivanna kept her composure but felt her stomach turn at his words. She knew that the cuts Hector proposed would compromise the essence of the project, the connection to Baixa Aldora's history that she so wanted to preserve. Yet, she also understood that ArcVision's support was crucial for the revitalization to continue. "I understand your concern, Hector," she responded, trying to maintain a diplomatic tone. "But we need to be careful. ArcVision chose this project because they want something that respects the neighborhood's memories. If we start cutting all the elements that make up Baixa Aldora's identity, we lose the original purpose. I know there's pressure, but there are other ways to optimize costs without compromising what makes this project unique." Hector slammed his palm on the table, exasperated, his gaze locked on Ivanna's, as if trying to understand why she clung so stubbornly to something that seemed so unrealistic to him. "You talk like it's simple, but the reality is that money doesn't come from these people's memories, Ivanna," he retorted, his voice a mix of weariness and frustration. "The investors want results. And they won't wait forever. If we don't deliver something tangible soon, the funding could dry up. And then what good is all this sentimentality?" Ivanna felt anger rising in her chest, but she took a deep breath before replying. She knew that a direct confrontation wouldn't change Hector's perspective. Over time, she had learned to find small compromises that could keep the project moving forward without sacrificing her principles. "What we're building here is more than an investment, Hector," she said, her voice softer but firm. "I believe that if we show the investors the positive impact these changes are already having on the community, they'll see the value in continuing. Baixa Aldora isn't just a set of numbers in a spreadsheet. It's a living history, and I'm not going to stop fighting for it." Hector didn't respond immediately. The truth was, he was starting to feel cornered by a pressure that came not only from the investors but also from something more internal, something deeper that he still didn't understand. Something in Ivanna's conviction, in the way she defended every part of the project, was beginning to shake his certainties. But he didn't want to, or perhaps didn't know how to, deal with that feeling. So, he chose a tactic he knew well, applying even more pressure. The next day, Ivanna arrived at the construction site and encountered a scene that made her stop abruptly. Some workers were dismantling part of the facade of a building she had fought to preserve, with Hector giving instructions to the supervising engineer. The sound of tools and the noise of bricks falling echoed through the streets like an open wound in what remained of the place's history. "What is going on here?" Ivanna demanded, her voice raised as she approached Hector with quick steps. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the heat of indignation rising to her face. Hector turned slowly, as if he had been expecting her reaction, maintaining a cold smile on his lips. "We're just being pragmatic, Ivanna. As you yourself said, we need to find ways to optimize costs. This facade was draining resources, so I made the decision to redirect funds to more critical areas." Ivanna felt a knot form in her throat. This was more than a financial decision for her. It was a blow to her vision, to everything she had been fighting for. She walked over to the engineer and asked him to stop the work immediately, but he hesitated, looking to Hector for guidance. "Stop this right now," Ivanna insisted, her voice firm. "This isn't part of the plan approved by ArcVision, and as the architect responsible for this project, I have the right to suspend any changes that haven't been discussed." Hector narrowed his eyes and took a step forward, closing the distance between him and Ivanna until only a few inches separated their faces. "You may have the title of lead architect, but don't forget who's really funding this. Do you think you can make decisions without considering the consequences? This project could collapse at any moment, and you'll be the first to fall when it does." Ivanna felt her eyes well up, but she refused to let him see her break. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with the same determination she had maintained from the start, even when it felt like she was fighting alone. "If that happens, at least I'll know I fought for what was right," she said, her voice trembling but filled with a sincerity that Hector couldn't ignore. "But what about you, Hector? When it's all over, what will you have besides a few more zeros in your bank account?" Hector felt a deep discomfort at her words, but as always, he masked it with a hard look and turned to leave. Ivanna's words echoed in his mind, and he felt a growing anger inside, directed not just at her, but also at himself. She had touched something he preferred to keep buried, something he had long abandoned in his pursuit of ambition. As Hector walked away, Ivanna felt the tears spill down her cheeks, but she quickly wiped them away before anyone could see. She looked at the damaged facade, feeling a mix of sadness and determination. She knew the fight wouldn't be easy, and that Hector would continue to be an obstacle at every step. But at that moment, something solidified inside her. A stronger desire to prove that her work held value, not just for the community, but for Velmor as a whole. As she walked back to the heart of the neighborhood, she heard a familiar voice calling her. It was Dona Lourdes, who had witnessed the argument from a distance. The older woman took Ivanna's hands, squeezing them tightly, as if trying to pass on some of her own resilience. "Don't lose heart, my dear," said Dona Lourdes, with a tired but kind smile. "We believe in you. And I know that, deep down, he will come to understand too." Ivanna returned the smile, though her eyes were still red. "Thank you, Dona Lourdes. I just hope it's not too late when that happens." That night, as the city of Velmor plunged into darkness, Ivanna returned to her apartment and worked late into the night, revising every detail of the project, searching for solutions that could balance the investors' demands with the need to preserve Baixa Aldora's history. She knew that each day was a battle, but she also knew she was no longer alone. Meanwhile, Hector, in his luxurious penthouse, looked out over the illuminated city from above, but for the first time, the view that had always seemed like a symbol of success now felt bitter. He wondered if, at some point in his life, he had lost something essential in his relentless pursuit of profit and status. And, despite himself, his last thoughts of the day weren't about spreadsheets and graphs, but of Ivanna's determined expression and the way she had fought for a simple old mansion. The confrontation between them was just beginning, but like two sides of the same coin, they were about to discover that there was far more at stake than just a revitalization project. The cold wind blew through the streets of Velmor, carrying with it the sounds of machines and the hammering from the construction work in Baixa Aldora. The central square, where old trees once stood proudly, was now a heap of rubble and churned-up earth. The transformation Ivanna had envisioned was becoming a reality, but not in the way she had imagined. Every day brought new challenges, and signs of exhaustion began to show on her face, reflected in the dark circles that grew deeper. Ivanna spent more and more time in meetings, balancing the demands of the residents, the technical adjustments, and the pressures from investors questioning the viability of preserving so many old structures. Arc Vision, initially excited about the innovative project, was beginning to express doubts. The executives wanted to see tangible progress, something to show that the revitalization of Baixa Aldora wasn't just an exercise in nostalgia but a real opportunity for profit. During one of these meetings, Hector received a call that left him silent for a long moment. On the other end, one of the project's most important investors had decided to withdraw part of their capital, citing the slow pace of the work and the insistence on preserving structures with no commercial value as reasons for jeopardizing the results. Hector tried to argue, but the response was cold and direct. Either you start delivering something worthwhile, or we're out for good. Hector hung up and stared out the office window, feeling the weight of a frustration he rarely showed. Losing that investment was a significant blow to his financial goals, and he knew he would have to make a quick decision to regain the trust of the remaining investors. That afternoon, he met Ivanna at one of the houses she was restoring. The place still smelled of fresh paint, with newly installed wooden beams and old glass panes being carefully replaced. Ivanna spoke enthusiastically about the details of each part of the restoration, showing how the original materials had been preserved to maintain the space's authenticity. "This is the heart of the project, Hector," she said, running her hand along the freshly painted walls, as if caressing a treasure. "This is how Baixa Aldora will rebuild itself, keeping the essence of what it's always been, but adapted for the future. The community is getting involved, reclaiming the spaces. This is what we need." But Hector was restless, his thoughts still echoing with the investor's words. He looked at Ivanna, his expression hardened, feeling an urgent need to make her understand the gravity of the situation. "Ivanna, we need to change our approach," he said, cutting her off abruptly. "One of our key investors has pulled out, and if we don't show immediate results, others might follow. We need to start considering more drastic cuts, focus on delivering what they want to see. I know you care about every detail, but we can't afford to keep this pace any longer." Ivanna stopped, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. Hector's words seemed to echo off the restored house's walls, like a warning that everything she had fought for was about to crumble. She looked at him, trying to see if there was any room for dialogue, for understanding. But all she saw was a determined yet empty expression, focused solely on saving the investment. "I'm not backing down, Hector," Ivanna replied, her voice wavering but firm. "This project can't just be another concrete block in Velmor. I won't turn Baixa Aldora into something it's not, into something it never was. If the price for keeping the investors' support is to destroy everything this neighborhood represents, then I'd rather find another solution." Hector laughed, but there was bitterness in his tone. He was tired of the constant battles with Ivanna, tired of feeling that no matter how much he tried to impose his vision, she always found a way to resist. "Do you really think you have that choice?" he retorted, crossing his arms. "The reality is, without the resources, there's no project at all. I've tried to negotiate, I've made too many concessions. Don't think you can keep going your own way without consequences. If you don't adapt, Ivanna, the whole project could sink. And I'm not going down with it." Ivanna felt the tears welling up, but she swallowed the lump in her throat, refusing to show any weakness. The pain of the threat of losing what she had built consumed her, but she wouldn't be intimidated. "If that happens, at least I'll know I fought for what I believed in," she said, her voice low but filled with an inner strength that Hector couldn't understand. "I don't care about titles, about the awards you want to win. I care about the people who live here, and I will keep fighting for them, even if that means standing up to you and anyone else who gets in my way." Hector remained silent, surprised by the intensity in Ivanna. He had always seen her as a young, idealistic, stubborn woman, but in that moment he realized she was much more than that. She was someone unafraid of losing, because her priorities were different, something he had forgotten how to feel. But at the same time, Hector knew that her words wouldn't change the immediate situation. The investors didn't care about passion and ideals. They wanted to see returns, they wanted to see money. And Hector knew that if he didn't deliver something concrete, not only Ivanna, but he himself could come out of this as a failure. And he couldn't bear that thought. In the days that followed, the distance between Hector and Ivanna grew even wider. Their meetings became cold and formal, each saying only what was necessary to keep the project moving forward. Hector refocused on the numbers, the spreadsheets, trying to find ways to cut costs without straying too far from the original plan. But to his surprise, the pressure on him only increased. The executives at ArcVision called for an emergency meeting to discuss the project's progress, and Hector felt his anxiety rise. Ivanna was also called in, but this time, she refused to give in to demands that compromised her principles. During the meeting, she fiercely defended every aspect of the project that involved community participation and the preservation of historical spaces. The executives were divided, some impressed by Ivanna's eloquence and the positive impact her ideas had already had on the residents, while others sided with Hector's vision, which promised quicker financial returns if there was less focus on preservation. The meeting ended without a clear consensus, but with a shadow of uncertainty hanging over both sides. That night, Ivanna returned to Baixa Aldora to find some comfort among the streets she loved so much. She stopped in front of a revitalized old house and listened to the sounds of residents gathering for a small community event. Children ran along the sidewalk, while adults chatted enthusiastically about the changes taking place. Donna Lourdes approached Ivanna and offered her a warm cup of tea, holding her hand tenderly. "You're making a difference, my dear," she said, squeezing Ivanna's fingers. "No matter what that man says, you have our support. And I know, deep down, he knows he needs you too." Ivanna smiled, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. Doubt gnawed at her heart, but she knew she couldn't give up now. Not after everything she had promised the residents, not after all the battles she had fought to get this far. Meanwhile, Hector spent a lonely evening in his office, leafing through financial documents and reviewing the investors' demands. The image of Ivanna, defending every detail of the project with such passion, wouldn't leave his mind. He wondered if, at some point, he himself had ever felt that kind of conviction about anything in his life. But at the same time, the need to prove his worth, to show that he still had control over the situation, kept him from admitting that he might be wrong. The silence of the night stretched over Velmor like a veil of uncertainty that enveloped the city and its two protagonists. The tensions between Ivanna and Hector had reached a critical point, and they both knew that somehow, the fate of the project and their own lives depended on a decision they weren't yet ready to make. The morning in Velmor was overcast, the heavy clouds casting a gray tone over the city that mirrored the mood of the past days. The work in Baixa Aldora continued, but now wrapped in a sense of uncertainty that seemed to weigh on every worker, every resident, and on Ivanna herself. Ivanna arrived early at the construction site, closely overseeing each stage of the process, determined to ensure that her vision was respected, even amid the adversity. But the truth was, doubts were growing like shadows in her mind. The pressure of budget cuts, Hector's constant interference, and the threat of losing ArcVision's support kept her in a state of constant vigilance. That afternoon, as Ivanna reviewed adjustments to one of the restored houses, one of Hector's assistants approached her with an expression of discomfort and urgency. "Ivanna, Mr. Hector asked you to go to the ArcVision office immediately. They want to discuss new adjustments to the project," he said, hesitating to meet her gaze. Ivanna felt a stab of worry pierce her chest. Meetings with ArcVision were becoming increasingly frequent, and each one brought new demands that threatened the integrity of what she had planned for Baixa Aldora. She knew the investors were restless, eager for more visible results and a quicker return on their investment. Upon arriving at the ArcVision office, she found Hector already seated at the conference table, arms crossed and a serious expression on his face. The executives, dressed in impeccable suits, observed her with calculating looks, as if every move she made could determine the fate of the project. Ivanna realized this wouldn't be an ordinary meeting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. "Ms. Ivanna, Mr. Hector," began one of the executives, adjusting his glasses while flipping through a detailed report. "We have been monitoring the progress of the project, and while we acknowledge the efforts of both of you, there is growing concern among our investors. The current pace and the focus on preserving old structures have not been deemed ideal for our short-term goals. We need changes. Immediately." Ivanna felt her throat go dry. She knew this was a direct threat to the heart of her work. Hector's gaze was fixed on her, as if he was waiting for her reaction, and Ivanna realized that he wouldn't try to intervene. On the contrary, he seemed ready to accept any decision that could save the numbers he valued so much. "I understand your concerns," Ivanna replied, trying to stay calm. "But cutting the focus on preserving the structures means losing the essence of the project, the very thing that drew ArcVision's attention in the first place. The residents of Baixa Aldora trust me to ensure these changes don't erase their memories, their stories. I believe we can find a middle ground, but I can't compromise everything I've fought for." The executive shook his head, unmoved, as he reviewed more documents. "Ms. Ivanna, we appreciate your passion. But the numbers speak for themselves. The investment needed to continue these restorations is high, and we don't have time to wait for uncertain returns. If there isn't an immediate adjustment, we will be forced to reconsider our involvement." Ivanna felt a chill run down her spine. The threat was clear. She looked at Hector, seeking some support, a sign that he was willing to fight for the project as she was. But Hector only averted his gaze, keeping his expression closed off. "Ivanna, maybe it's time to rethink some things," he finally said, his voice sounding distant, almost cold. "We need to be realistic. I know you care about these details, but in the end, it's the economic viability that keeps all of this going. If we don't do what they ask, we lose everything." Hector's words felt like a punch to Ivanna's gut, but she also knew that, in a way, he was right. Without ArcVision's support, the project could come to a complete halt, and everything she had fought for could be buried once and for all. But giving in would mean betraying the residents of Baixa Aldora, breaking the promises she had made to each of them, destroying the essence of her vision. Ivanna took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. She felt the weight of her decision pressing against her chest, but when she opened her eyes, there was a renewed determination in her gaze. "I'm not abandoning Baixa Aldora," she said, her voice filled with resolve. "I believe there's another way to keep this project alive, one that respects what we've promised the residents and can still bring the returns you're looking for. But for that, I need a vote of confidence. I need you to give me some time, and I'll prove that it's possible." The ArcVision executive raised an eyebrow, surprised by Ivanna's response. Hector watched her with a mix of frustration and something he couldn't quite identify, maybe reluctant admiration, or maybe just the irritation of seeing someone so unyielding. "You're risking a lot, Ivanna," said Hector, almost in a warning tone. And if you fail? Have you thought about the consequences? Ivanna looked him straight in the eye, as if trying to break through all the walls he had built around himself. Yes, I've thought about the consequences, Hector. She turned her gaze back to the executives, her voice steady. But I also believe in the possibilities. Give me 3 more months to show that this approach can deliver results. I'm willing to put my name on the line, to take on the responsibility. But please, don't take this opportunity away from Velmor before we see what's truly possible. Hector felt a growing discomfort, something he hadn't felt in a long time. There was a raw courage in the way Ivanna spoke, something he hadn't recognized in himself for years. He knew he could end up suffering the consequences of this gamble, but, for the first time, he couldn't find the strength to contradict her. The Arc Vision executives exchanged glances for what felt like an eternity before one of them finally nodded. "Very well, Ms. Ivanna," he said, his voice formal and distant. 3 months. That's the time we'll give you to show results. But if there is no concrete progress, there will be no further negotiations. Do you agree with this, Mr. Hector? Hector felt a pang of insecurity but knew he had no other choice. "I agree," he replied, his voice sounding firm, though he was conflicted inside. The meeting ended in heavy silence, and Ivanna left the room feeling a mix of relief and fear. She had one more time, but the stakes were high. Everything depended on her ability to make things happen, to show that her vision for Baixa Aldora was not just a romantic dream, but a real possibility. As she walked back to the construction site, Ivanna realized that this might be her last chance to save the project. She knew she needed to involve the community even more, speed up the restoration processes, and find ways to optimize costs without compromising the essence of her plan. But there was something else she had to face, the reality that Hector, no matter how hard she tried, might never become the ally she hoped for. Hector, meanwhile, returned to his office with a strange feeling of emptiness. He knew he had made the right decision to keep the investors satisfied, but he couldn't shake the sense that he was losing something greater, something that couldn't be measured in numbers or square footage. Ivanna's determination, the way she poured herself into the project, lingered in his mind, and he wondered why it bothered him so much. The clouds over Velmor continued to hide the sun, but somewhere, in the midst of the shadows, there was the possibility of a new path, a path that neither Ivanna nor Hector could yet see clearly. The city kept breathing, and in its streets, the hopes and fears of its inhabitants echoed at every corner, waiting for the unfolding of a story that was far from over. The atmosphere in Velmor seemed to have become an extension of the tension dominating the project. The days were gray, low clouds casting a permanent shadow over Baixa Aldora, and the cold wind blowing through the narrow streets seemed to reflect the growing urgency among those involved in the project. Ivanna knew that the 3-month deadline given by Arc Vision wasn't just an extension of time, but a sentence hanging over her head. The pressure to deliver tangible results had never been so intense, and every small delay, every misstep in planning, felt like a step toward failure. But despite the weight on her shoulders, Ivanna refused to give up. The energy she showed, even on the toughest days, was impressive. She spent entire days on the construction sites, overseeing every detail, and nights reviewing blueprints and schedules. As Ivanna walked through the neighborhood streets, she was met with the hopeful gazes of the residents. The trust they had placed in her, the support she received every day, was what kept her going. But at the same time, it also increased the weight of the responsibility she felt. The project was no longer just a professional matter, it had become a promise that Baixa Aldora wouldn't just become another erased spot on Velmor's expanding map. Hector, on the other hand, seemed increasingly disconnected from that connection. He had returned to his routine at the office, focusing on meetings with investors and spreadsheets that tracked the project's financial progress. But no matter how much he tried to distance himself emotionally, he couldn't completely ignore what was happening. The image of Ivanna, determined and tireless, lingered in his mind. In the days that followed the meeting with Arc Vision, Hector began visiting the construction sites more frequently, closely observing the work being done. The atmosphere at the sites was intense. The workers knew there was an imminent deadline and that any mistake could mean the end of everything. Ivanna led each operation with impressive strength, splitting her time between manual labor and the engineering decisions she needed to make in real time. During one of these visits, Hector found her in a house under restoration, poring over a stack of documents while discussing with a group of workers how best to preserve an old wall that had developed cracks. "If we can't stabilize this, the risk of collapse is high," one of the engineers said, pointing to the worn-out wall. "It's going to be expensive to keep it here. Maybe it's safer to demolish and rebuild." Ivanna shook her head, determined not to give up on preserving that part of the house. She knew what that structure meant to the residents, and demolishing any part of it would be a defeat for her vision. "We can't just demolish it," she replied firmly. "We need to find another solution. Maybe reinforce it with modern materials from the inside while keeping the external structure intact. If we do that, we preserve the visual integrity and ensure safety." Hector, who had been watching in silence, stepped closer. He was still torn between his logic of efficiency and what he was starting to see in Ivanna, the passion she put into every decision. Even though he still found many of her ideas impractical, it was impossible to ignore the conviction with which she defended each choice. "You're taking a big risk, Ivanna," he said, lacking his usual coldness. "Sometimes, you have to know when to let go of something. These old structures, maybe it's easier to leave them behind." Ivanna looked at him, surprised that his words sounded more like advice than criticism. She held his gaze, but there was a trace of exhaustion in her eyes. "I know that's how you think, Hector," she said, her voice softer but still resolute. "But I can't let this go. I can't abandon what these houses mean. Each one of them tells a story, and I won't give up on preserving them until there's no other option." Hector remained silent for a moment, watching Ivanna as she moved away to continue her discussions with the engineers. He felt a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. The truth was, Hector had never allowed himself to feel such a deep connection to any of his projects. To him, buildings were structures to be erected, demolished, or sold. But Ivanna saw the houses and structures as something far more significant. He couldn't fully understand it, but somehow it intrigued him. As the days passed, tensions grew. The 3-month deadline was rapidly approaching, and Ivanna began to feel the strain. Her body showed signs of fatigue, and sleepless nights started to affect her performance. Donna Lourdes and other residents came to the construction site, bringing food, tea, and words of encouragement, but Ivanna knew she needed much more than that to keep the project on track. One afternoon, after an especially long day of work, Ivanna went to Donna Lourdes' apartment for a conversation. She needed a break, a momentary escape from the crushing pressure she felt. As they sat in Donna Lourdes' cozy living room, surrounded by old photos and family keepsakes that told the story of this strong woman, Ivanna finally allowed her emotions to surface. "I feel like I'm failing," Ivanna confessed, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm fighting so hard, but every day it feels like I'm further from achieving what I promised. I don't know what else to do." Donna Lourdes observed her in silence for a moment, then held Ivanna's hands tightly, her gaze filled with tenderness and wisdom. "My dear, fighting for what you believe in is never easy," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've seen so many changes in Baixa Aldora over the years, so many broken promises, so many lost hopes. But you're different. You're here for us, not for yourself, and that's something no one can take away from you. No matter what happens, you've already done more for this neighborhood than many who came before. And that, my dear, is already a victory." Ivanna smiled, tears in her eyes, feeling a wave of gratitude for Donna Lourdes and for everyone who supported her. She knew that even if everything collapsed, at least she had fought with all her strength. In the following days, Ivanna returned to work with renewed determination, even though her body was still exhausted. She knew the struggle would be long and difficult, but she was ready to face it. And, surprisingly, Hector began to take a closer interest in the project, not as an opponent but as a more attentive observer. He still had his doubts, but something about Ivanna's persistence began to break down his barriers. One afternoon, when the sun finally broke through Velmor's gray clouds, Hector appeared unexpectedly at the construction site, bringing a new proposal. He had found a way to reallocate some of the funds, reducing the cuts without compromising too much on the preservation aspects that Ivanna valued so highly. "I still don't fully understand your vision," Hector admitted, handing Ivanna the documents. "But I'm starting to see that maybe there's more here than I thought. Let's see what we can do with this." Ivanna stood in silence for a moment, surprised, but then accepted the papers with a nod of gratitude. It wasn't a complete concession, but it was the beginning of something. A small shift in how Hector viewed the project and, perhaps, how he viewed her too. The deadline kept approaching, and Ivanna knew there was still much work to be done. But, for the first time in weeks, she felt that she was no longer fighting this battle alone.